and indeed a very comprehensive address from the Russian President Vladimir Putin in that State of the Nation address delivered in the country's capital, Moscow. We know, of course, that it is the 14th time that Putin has given that address, and as usual, he touched on a broad range of national issues. He flagged the need to invest in national and regional infrastructure for development, as well as the need for better social welfare structures for the country's most vulnerable people. Now, of course, it is all ahead of a presidential election. Putin has vowed to cut the rate of poverty by half in the next 6 years. Let's bring you some insight now on that speech. I'm joined here in studio in Nairobi by Dr. Francis Onditi, who is the senior lecturer and head of department at the School of International Relations and Diplomacy at Riara University here in Kenya. Doctor, what would you say were the key highlights for you, at least, from this address by Vladimir Putin?
Thank you very much. President Putin just walked into what we used to know, the 1990s and later years, the new foreign policy concept, which develops three pillars of the country's domestic and foreign policy, that is Russia. One is economism. The second one that he anchored his speech is pragmatism, and then universalism. But then he really focused on the domestic policy, which highlighting issues to do with the social policy, how it's going to make sure that the life expectancy of Russian people maintains at 70. It has, I think, hit 70. And then getting to also into how that country can be able to rejuvenate economic storm by increasing the infrastructural development as well as entrepreneurship. So it's really not very different from the framework of Russian domestic policy that is anchored on the three things we have discussed, but also trying to show the solidarity or encouraging the people of Russia to continue being solid on the foreign policy. So, yeah. And
as you said, he did spend a lot of time talking about domestic issues, domestic policy, and quite ambitious, wanting to maintain life expectancy, wanting to cut the rate of poverty in the next 6 years. Is that achievable, or is this just talk ahead of an election?
Yes or no, but I would say this. If you look at the trend of Russia from 1990s, when the country had challenging economic times, especially after transitioning from Soviet to Russia, you know, the economy was really performing badly. But around the millennium, when Putin took over from the former president, you realize the economy started booming, and how Russia survived the 2008, 2007 economic meltdown is actually defining the economic muscle of that country. That means that the 7% GDP that the country has been oscillating can be able to be maintained. But also, don't forget that one of the pillars of their domestic and foreign policy is actually to increase entrepreneurship, how to encourage young people to participate in economic development. So yes, if you look at it from that framework, yes. But again, if you put it on the on the global scale, you realize that Russia does not really generate as much resource as it is supposed to do, perhaps because of the stiff competition that they experience in the global marketplace.
And of course, we can't ignore the fact that it is an election year. We know that most likely that Putin might eventually, of course, win this very election. But how is this year, or how is this coming election likely to shape the political landscape?
In the recent past, Putin has cracked down the opposition. Putin, even though on one side the pillar, one of their national foreign policy pillar talks about universalism, which means they have to appreciate democracy, they have to appreciate human rights, but he does the opposite. He does the opposite because they have not been tolerating the opposition. You remember a number of the opposition have gotten into the jail, some have lost life. So we would I wouldn't want to assume that there would be any opposition against Putin. He is likely to rule Russia until perhaps a time when he feels, okay, it is the right time to hand over the baton. Yeah.
And of course, we've been paying attention to this speech all morning. Why does it matter to Africa, in your words, in your view at least? I mean, why should Africa be paying attention to what the Russian president has to say today?
Let me say, Russia-Africa relation is, in the recent past, it has been growing by actually 16%. The investment they have in Africa, it's reached actually 20 billion US dollar. Although if you compare it to China, it's still low because China has hit around 190 billion. That is nothing compared to China. But you would look at it this way. Russia, South Africa, you know, the kind of investment is doing in South African countries, particularly South Africa, Angola, you know, and even other parts like Nigeria. So when you put that together, then that tells you that Russia is still so much interested in promoting African economic, you know, growth. And don't also forget that, you know, Egypt, you know, they've been supportive of Egypt, especially in terms of hydroelectric power plants. They have also developed interest in some countries that Russia never used to have interest, like Kenya. You remember that one of the areas they have been focusing on their visits and all that has been Kenya, Zimbabwe also. Nigeria has also been on the list of Putin as he visits Africa. So it's an idea which they will continue to cultivate because they know, one, that is the only way they can mitigate the influence of U.S., particularly U.S. and the alliance, its alliance. But secondly, is also safeguarding, you know, it's trying to safeguard the, you know, the Russian legacy, especially after the 1980s and 1990s difficulties that Russia experienced in Africa. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Onditi, giving us there an analysis of that State of the Nation address from Russia's President Vladimir Putin.